So remember that when factoring these, because we have both the x squared and the x, it tells me that I'm going to end up with a factored form that's going to be like x plus or minus some number squared. So now to figure out the number that goes inside here, we see 2 times what gives me this minus 18? And what times itself equals 81. And both of these cases, yes, that number is 9. Actually, more specifically, negative 9. Because notice this is a negative 18 here. And so that's why it's x minus 9 squared. For the next one, same basic idea. What number times 2 equals a negative 14? Negative 7. Okay, so we're looking to see if it's x minus 7 squared. And we check that by looking to see what is negative 7 squared. Does that give us 49?
Yes.
Yes, it does. So then, yes, that is the correct factored form. All right, now for this last one. What's 2 times what is 22? It's got to be 11. So let's try 11. What is 11 squared?
121.
121. So yes, that one works there as well. So those are your 3 answers for our factored forms here. Now today we're going to be getting into a lot more expanding stuff. So going the other way now. So let's see how well you remember expanding these, or in other words, multiplying them out, or using distributive property. So please multiply both of these out. All right, so for this first one here, I'm going to be multiplying this 5x squared by every single one of these terms. So first up, when I do the 5x squared just times the 6x to the 8th, I do the 5 times the 6, which gives me 30. And then when we do x squared times x to the 8th, remember that means we add the exponents. So that ends up being x to the 10th. Now we repeat the process by going the 5x squared to the 4x. So 5 times 4 gives me 20. And x squared times x, remember this x here is really an x to the power of 1. So it becomes x cubed, because I do the 2 plus the 1. And then I multiply the 5x squared by the minus 9. So it becomes minus 5 times 9 is 45. And the x squared, there's no x with the 9, so it stays in x squared. Right. Now for the last one here. Again, we multiply the first parentheses by the second, but in this case that means multiplying everything in the first by everything in the second. So I'm going to do x times x first, which gives me x squared. Then we do x times the minus 2, so that's minus 2x. Now we do the 7 to both of them. So 7 times x is going to give me plus 7x. And then the 7 times the minus 2 gives me minus 14. Now, I'm not going to stop here, though, because you'll notice here that we actually have like terms. Those are both just a plain old x, which means we can actually add those together. The x squared, there's no other x squared, so it stays that. But then negative 2x plus 7x, negative 2 plus 7 is 5, so it's 5x. And then the minus 14, there's no like terms with that, so it stays at minus 14. This is your final answer that we're looking for here. Now today we're going to be building off of these skills to increase your ability to handle more and more complex mathematics and algebra. So now let's take it up one more step. Let's see if you remember how to do these.
Probably not.
And then we'll take it up one step from that.
Easy.
And we'll tackle those and so on. All right, so for the first one, again, we approach it where we multiply everything in the first by everything in the second. So 4x times 3x gives me 12x squared. 4x times 5 gives me 20x. And then I do the 1 times both of those. So 1 times 3x gives me 3x. And 1 times 5 gives me 5. Now we look to combine like terms. We only have the 2 like terms, which are the x terms. The 12x squared stays the same. But 20x plus 3x, that's going to be 23x. And then plus the 5 hanging on the end stays there. There's our final answer for that one. That is expanded completely. That is multiplied out. And then for this last one, First of all, with the last one, the answer is not x squared minus 100. Because remember what squaring something means. In order to square something, that means to multiply it by itself. So this is really x minus 10 times x minus 10. And then we could still multiply everything in the first parentheses by everything in the second. Oops. And then when we combine like terms here, we end up with x squared minus 20x plus 100, which should hopefully seem familiar to you. Notice that if I gave you this equation and asked you to factor it, you would end up with this. Because this is this factored form. All we did was expand it out. We just went the other direction from the factor. All right, and so if you remember that pattern and recognize it, you even could have said, hey, I know anytime I have an x plus or minus a number squared, that the middle number will be double, and the last number will be that squared. And you could have actually used that pattern to expand it out, just like we use that pattern in our factoring. Now, I said we're upping things a little bit today, so this is the first step of that, where notice in this case, for the first time, we're going to be multiplying a trinomial by a binomial.
Ew.
Instead of just monomials or binomials by each other. All right, so now in order to multiply this out, we use the same basic principle as what we've used before. And the way that we've handled these before is we multiplied everything in the first parentheses by everything in the second. That's the same thing we're going to do with this, just there's a few more things to multiply. So, I multiply the x squared by x. And when I do x squared times x, that ends up giving me x cubed. Then I do the x squared times the minus 3, which gives me minus 3x squared. Then we do it with the 5x. So 5x times x is 5x squared. Then 5x times the minus 3 is negative 15x. Now we do it with the 1. This is where this is just a little bit harder. It just means we got a few more to multiply. The 1 times x gives me x. And the 1 times negative 3 gives me minus 3. Now again, I look for like terms. And of these like terms, I have x squareds. And I have x's that are like each other. And so I'm going to go ahead and add and subtract those. Notice the x cubed, there were no like terms with the x cubed. Then, when I do the x squareds together, negative 3 plus 5 gives me a positive 2, so that's plus 2x squared.
I don't have room.
Now we do the x's. Negative 15x plus x, that's like negative 15 plus 1. That's going to give me a negative 14x. And then the minus 3 hanging on the end, again, there were no like terms with it, so it stays a minus 3. And so there's your final answer. Notice it's the same idea as what we did before when we multiplied two binomials. It just has an extra step in it because we got to multiply something extra in one of the parentheses.
This is extra.
All right, now I want you to practice that idea. Please practice it with this one, please. All right, so this time we're expanding. Notice it says expand this time. The last one said multiply, but they mean the same thing. And so in order to do it, I'm still going to multiply everything in the first parentheses by everything in the second parentheses. So that means I do x times x squared. Then I do x times the minus 7x. Then we do x times 6. Now we repeat the process with the 4. So I do 4 times x squared. I do 4 times the minus 7x. And I do the 4 times the 6. Now, having done that, I look for any like terms that I can combine. In this case, they didn't end up right next to each other and all pretty like they did with the last one, but I can still find some like terms. So notice I have a couple of them that are x squareds. And I got a couple of them that are just plain old x's. So I can still combine them. All right, so x cubed first. Now I go on to the x squared terms. So I got a negative 7x squared plus 4x squared. Negative 7 plus 4 is a negative 3. So that's going to be minus 3x squared. Now I go on to the x terms. So 6 plus a negative 28. That's going to give me a negative 22. So minus 22x. And then the plus 24 hanging on the end, it stays the plus 24 because there were no like terms with it. And there's your final answer. Now, we just started by looking at maybe a binomial times a trinomial, an extension of what we had done before. This is also an extension of what we've done before. We're now going to be multiplying 3 things together and seeing how we handle that. So again, write down the original equation or original expression here. Now, when we're multiplying 3 things, we don't want to try to do everything all at once. Pick 2 and multiply 2 of them together, and then we'll go from there. Now, which 2 you choose to multiply first doesn't actually matter. Some questions, one thing will be easier than the other. Some questions, it won't matter. It's a personal preference thing usually. So I'm going to pick 2 of them. I'm going to multiply the first 2 together, just because I don't think it necessarily matters to do it any other way. So I do the 3 times the 6. That gives me 18. And then the x squared, it just stays an x squared there. Now, how am I going to write this step though? Because I'm multiplying 3 things together, I need to show that that is still being multiplied by the 10x to the 4th. So I put parentheses around both of those pieces. And that shows that they're both being multiplied. Now I multiply those 2. So 18 times 10, remember anytime you multiply by 10, that means just add a 0 to the end. So 18 times 10 is 180. And then x squared times x to the 4th gives me x to the 6th power. And that's going to be our final answer. Now, looking back at what we just did this 3 at the start here, did I multiply it by both the 6 and the 10?
No, you didn't.
No. It only multiplies by one of them. Because when I first multiplied it by those 2, then I had this number. So the 3 is in that 18. And when I then multiplied that by the 10, since the 3 was in the 18, the 3 ended up getting multiplied by the 10 that way. It basically carried through in order to be able to get there. So when you have 3 things multiplied together, pick 2, multiply them, and then multiply that result by the 3rd thing. Now, it might be even easier to see if we make things more complicated, which sounds weird, but sometimes it is easier once we make things a little tougher. So let's take a look at how we'd multiply these 3 together.
No.
All right, so now with this one, again, we start the same way by picking 2 and multiplying 2. And so I'm going to go ahead and just multiply the first 2 together first. When I do that, I do the 5x times x. That gives me 5x squared. And then I do the 5x times the minus 3. That gives me minus 15x. Now that whole thing is now going to be multiplied still by the x minus 8. I just carry that x minus 8 down. So I pick 2, multiply those 2. Doesn't matter which other ones. And then once I've multiplied 2 of them, I multiply that by the 3rd. So now I'm going to multiply those through. So I'm going to do the 5x squared times x. Gives me 5x cubed. Then I do the 5x squared times the minus 8. So that's going to be minus 40x squared. Now I do it with the minus 15x. So minus 15x times x gives me minus 15x squared. And then the minus 15x times the minus 8. And a negative 15 times 8 ends up giving us 120x. All right, and again, we look for any like terms that I can put together here. And yes, those middle 2 will combine, so I go 5x cubed minus 55x squared plus 120x. Now, going back to the start of our problem here. I could also have started this problem by multiplying those two parentheses together and then taking that result and multiplying it by the 5x. It would have given me the exact same answer. So it doesn't matter which two you choose to multiply together at the start. Just pick two and multiply those. All right, now we're going to approach this one the same way. If I'm going to multiply this whole thing out, since there's three things, I need to pick two, multiply those two, and then go from there. Now, so that we're all doing the same work the same way, go ahead and please start by multiplying those two together. So on your paper, do that work, please. So in multiplying the x plus 1 times x minus 4, you would start by getting x squared minus 4x plus x minus 4, and then you'd simplify it to be x squared minus 3x minus 4. Now, that x plus 11 is still there, so I put parentheses around that so that I can show it's still being multiplied by the x plus 11. Now, once we get to that point, we can go ahead and multiply everything in the first parenthesis by everything in the second. But notice, I did simplify that first. Technically, you could still multiply them both together at this point, but it's a lot more work, so why do it that way? Simplify, then multiply. All right, so right now, go ahead and multiply everything in the first parentheses by everything in the second parentheses again. Okay, this is the answer that we should get before we simplify, and then once again look for those like terms that you can actually put together. And then this is where you should end up. So this is your final answer for this problem.